All right. Hey, thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate it, even though Bob probably won't, Susan. Anyway, Bob Budd is well known in Wyoming as the director of the Wyoming Wildlife Natural Resources Trust, which was a really cool idea that began over a decade ago now in Wyoming to take and build a pretty good corpus that would be used, the interest could be used on an annual basis to fund wildlife projects around the state. And when I say wildlife projects, I mean really focused on the ground kind of projects. And Bob has been at the helm since day one and has done an exceptional job with that. He's also continues and has been since its inception the chairman of the Sagegrouse implementation team, which is the body that Tom was just discussing about, a governing body that makes some decisions that really drives the ship with coordinating all of the different entities that are involved in either effects of potential listing by sage-grouse or that it's interested in managing and conserving sage-grouse across the state. Bob's been involved in the effort, the core area strategy development, and the now well over a decade old plan that we've implemented in our state, 3 different governor executive orders, actually more than 3 executive orders focused on sage-grouse now, but with 3 different governors. He's been on the leading edge of all of those efforts and certainly knows a lot. He's a subject matter expert with regards to policy and sagebrush rangelands as well as sage-grouse. He does, before that, he had a ranching background. He's been a land manager at a large ranch in Wyoming. And like I said, he's a sagebrush expert. He's a pretty smart guy, actually. But what I will tell you is that he's actually just a terrible fisherman. And he's one of those fishermen who likes to use his fish finder really only to his benefit. And what he does is he tries to move the boat right over the top of where the fish are so that his line is where the fish are and nobody else gets to catch any fish. And he still doesn't catch any. His wife is actually, though, luckily a very good fisherman. So it's good to go fishing with Bob and his wife, because at least his wife knows what she's doing and can get things done. She's also really smart too. She's actually quite a bit smarter than Bob. But anyway, Bob, I'm sure we'll have some great things to say here today, and I look forward to listening to him.
Okay, Bob, over to you.
Good morning, and the only thing I'm not sure about is how to advance the slides. Susan, is it a click will work?
I'm actually going to advance them for you just so that we can make sure that we keep everything together. So if you just say next, then I will make sure to do that. Okay.
I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but just as a reminder, what led to this type of an approach for management and policy on a species? You had a species that was ubiquitous in Wyoming. It was wide-ranging, very, very different kind of critter. A lot of things we knew and a lot of things we didn't. You had the Endangered Species Act overlay. And so people rose up. We had the first meeting in 2007 in Casper and thought we'd get, 50 or 60 sagebrusophiles, if you will. We had well over 250 people at that meeting in Casper. And that was what led to the creation of the SIGIT, the Sagegrouse implementation team. Next. The basics on sage-grouse, again, I don't need to go through all the details, but you have the issue of fidelity. You have whether they're local or migratory. You've got habitat preferences that range across the sagebrush ecotone. They got, they're a landscape species, and their hardwired success strategies may not be totally suited to today. Next. We also overlap with 73 other species of greatest environmental concern. Nearly a third of species of concern are in our sage-grouse conservation efforts. And later, as we got into this, that was one of the things we started to investigate, was how much overlap there was and whether what we were doing for sage-grouse was beneficial to those other species. So that brought in a completely different group of people who had an interest in the outcome with sage-grouse. Next. So our strategy was pretty simple. It's conserve populations and habitats where we can have the most effect. Obviously, that's the core areas. We wanted to maintain our economic opportunity, particularly where we had minimal conflicts. We wanted a sound ecological and economic model for conservation, and we wanted to include major stakeholders in the decision-making process. And that last one is the one that really set then Governor Friedenthal off. He cornered me after the Casper meeting and said, we need solutions. We don't need pretty papers and pictures and PowerPoints. He hated PowerPoints. And he said, I want solutions. And so Ryan Lance and I noodled around on it a little bit, went back in and said, you know, we think maybe we ought to put together a group of people that has oil and gas, environmental interests, agency people, the whole big deal. Had a list of about 26 tribes, you name it. And he looked at me and said, you've lost your mind. He said, if it works, I'm taking full credit. And if not, you're fired. And that was pretty much the way we went from there. So next. The process part, I think, is the part Tom really wanted me to get into. And that, from the get-go, we had all of those different interests involved and engaged. And I underline engage here on the screen because it's really important that they be bought in, but it's also important that they have what they bring to the table is there for everyone else. We did end up with 26 people. We had 2 from mining, 2 from oil and gas, 2 from agriculture, 2 from conservation groups. We had all of the federal and state agencies. We had county government. We had you name it. And it was an open participatory process. We had the 26 seated at the table, but we would have meetings with as many as 150 people in the room. And we allowed them to participate as long as they were polite. One of the key things we learned along the way, or that I learned along the way, is that you have to be a learning organization. And when I say that, we spent the first meeting or 2, we met about every 10 days for 6 months to get this done. You had to have, we started out with Sagegrouse 101, and then we did Sagebrush 101. We did all of that, and all of a sudden we hit a brick wall. I mean, you couldn't move an inch. And it occurred to me that one of the problems was we'd never done oil and gas 101. So you had 2 people at the table, maybe a half a dozen, who actually understood what the process was to go from a lease to exploration to development to ultimately production. And so we went back and did mining 101, oil and gas 101, grazing 101, to make sure everybody was on the same page. Next. We were time controlled. That was really what was an advantage of having the governors work on this. You'd go in, sit down, and he'd say, well, how soon can you do it? Usually you'd kind of hedge that. The 6 months we gave, we said we thought we could do it in 6 months. He said, well, I'll give you 4. Ultimately, we took the 6, but we had strict timelines. And if you don't, you get a lot of mission drift. But as a chairman, for me to be able to say, guys, we got 3 more meetings and this is going to be done, that put people back onto focus. And that was really, really critical. We used a work in progress approach. We didn't keep minutes. We didn't do that. We started with an outline for a document that became the executive order, the first one, and now all of them. And we added to it at each meeting, or we deleted from it. So we'd get to a point, we'd send everybody out, they could review it for about 10 days, you'd go back through. And after you'd cooked it, you know, you'd get one section, it'd be pretty well cooked, and then you didn't need to go back to it. Everybody was happy with it. It's important to note it was not consensus-based as consensus is defined. It was goal-driven, and we had 2 things: conserve populations and habitat and allow for development and economic activity. Next. So what were the key things? It was to remove or ameliorate threats, the biological base that we had to address. That was number 1. Secondly, we had to have adequate regulatory mechanisms to meet the requirements of the ESA and other laws. And finally, we used a 3 pronged approach. You avoid conflict, avoid impacts. Where you can't do that, you minimize them to the greatest degree possible. And if you still have areas, prior existing rights and other things, where you can't avoid and minimize, or you've done all you can, then you allow mitigation. And mitigation in our state has always been provided ahead of time, and it's always been a habitat provision. Next. Next. We used the COT report. I sat on that group when it was developed. We used that as kind of our framework on the habitat side. We looked at what the potential threats were and then evaluated how we could manage each of those. And then on the regulatory side, we ultimately used an executive order because we didn't believe, and I still don't, we could have gotten 90 legislators to sit down and write a technical document like the executive orders are. The regulatory process would have been over 50 state agencies that would have had to adopt identical rules. That probably wasn't going to happen, and voluntary wasn't adequate. Next. We recognized existing rights, and that got very interesting because, as an example, we did not count a lease as an existing right. We only counted a permit. That was with industry's blessing, but there were some who came in, and as we got new companies, they pushed back on that. But ultimately, industry itself was the one that said, no, we're going to self-regulate and we're going to do it right. And until you have a permit, we're not going to say you have a right. The reason that was critical in Wyoming is that probably 80% of our state was already leased for something. So if you said that's a prior right and there's no rules, we had no rules. With mining, we relied on SMACRA with and until the bird was not a candidate, and then we had to go back and provide state protections on coal. Next. So the core area strategy started with the birds we have. This is a map from Doherty. I think this is a 208 map. And we sat down and said, okay, well, where are the birds? And they told us where they needed to be. Those areas became areas managed primarily for sage-grouse. It was the best of the best. But as we developed it, we wanted to go out and make sure that we had adequate buffers, if you will, or adequate protection, because we knew we were going to lose some areas that had already been developed. Next. So the high productivity areas that were lost, we added others in. And you can see on this where, if you look right there at the center right, where we went up and picked up some lesser productive areas to make up for some that had already been developed. And that's the Powder River Basin. You can see where you've got red that isn't in. That was well developments at spacings of up to 4 acres. Next. This is the valid existing rights, and we looked at that as we had a credible development potential, not just whether or not it might be there. These are well locations at the time we did it, and you can see why we didn't have core area in that upper northeast corner. Next. Then we went back and analyzed that again based on local knowledge. You can see all of those red polygons. Those were done by Nissa Whitford and myself, and we went in and looked at, with aerial photos, what the habitat was, whether those needed to be included or not included, and adjusted there. Next. Then we went and verified, this is mapping, habitat mapping, veg mapping that we went back and did, and looked at whether or not our core areas actually matched up with where the habitat was. And as you can see, that was spot on. Next. So the best available science led us to avoidance, minimization, and mitigation. And then it built a tolerance understanding. And that was the creation of the density and disturbance calculation tool. And what we did with that is we said, okay, at a level based on the science we had primarily out of Northeast Wyoming with oil and gas, that 5% disturbance where you measure everything. We include all disturbance, fire, everything at a 1 meter scale, that the birds were not impacted. So we created the DDCT to analyze what was on the ground before somebody did a project and whether or not it could be allowed. That that required a lot of monitoring and consistency across the state, and it required an adaptive management approach, which we implemented early on in 2008. Next. The results were we suddenly started getting multiple wells on a single pad. We had directional drilling. We had road siting. We had companies that were sharing roads where they previously would have built 2 roads or 3. The road design took into account sage-grouse habitat needs and wasn't just a 20-foot crown and ditch road every time. We used remote sensing instead of human monitoring. We did conservation easements to protect against the threat of ex-urban development. It guided where our reclamation would go, where restoration was, and it also guided mine plans and then enhancements that we did on the ground. Next. So I just used these because this was the peak of our development period, but we had a massive change in what happened. Vertically drilled single well permits went from 65% reduction. Directional went up by 66. Horizontal went up by 1,337%. And the total number of wells increased, but the footprint radically decreased. And that was because we had the ability to do that analysis, that density and disturbance analysis, and we had the ability to work with the companies and say, look, if you can move this well a quarter mile, a half mile, if you can do this, if you can get behind a natural barrier, that will minimize your impact. And obviously there was an incentive there that we found in the middle of the process, and that was economic. They actually became more economical. So companies were very, very anxious to work with us. Next. So the strategy is to have a defensible management strategy. Can we go out and say that what we're doing actually is increasing habitat? Are we able to say that the birds are using it? Can we quantify what we're doing? The answer is yes. Do we gain flexibility in core areas, but you had to have the data up front? We gained a better understanding of sage-grouse tolerances. What can they tolerate? What can't they? We put well over $1 million into research in the course of our program. And always, every time we looked at a project, we came back to those 3 major tenets: void, minimize, and mitigate, and had success with that. Next. And finally, as we did that, we went back and we checked back with our federal partners. This was the statement they made, that if this was implemented by all landowners, including federal, it would provide adequate protection for sage-grouse and their habitat. And that was the end result of what our program did. So I'm going to stop there, Susan, and hopefully we have time for questions. But that's a quick, dirty overview of where we're at.
Thanks very much for that, Bob. That was an excellent presentation. Really enjoyed that. I am looking now to see if we have any questions. I'm looking for raised hands or any questions that have been submitted. I'm not seeing any right now. Liz is also helping to monitor this. Liz, do we have any hands raised or questions submitted?
Not currently. And just a
So
reminder to folks, you can add those at the bottom with your Q&A and with the hand raise icon.
Okay, thank you.
I might make one point while we're waiting then.
Sure.
That is that I think you have to give a lot of credit to all of the different people who participated, and I kind of glossed that over. You know, Game and Fish's initial reaction, I hope Brian's still on, was, hey, this is our domain. We're supposed to do this. And that we worked through that. Fish and Wildlife at the time had some jurisdiction. BLM said this is happening on our lands. And the way that we got there is that everybody was equal in this process. In other words, we didn't regulate state lands differently than private, differently than federal. It was all universal. So we were blind to land ownership. We recognized the Game and Fish has the authority over wildlife, but their forte wasn't really policy side. So everybody brought something to the table and everybody gave a little bit up. And that was really critical. And that was probably the first 3 or 4 meetings. It was feeling out where those lines were. But that's something I thought I ought to add there.
Thanks, Bob. It looks like we've got a couple questions that are starting to come in through the question box. I've got 2 of them. I'll start with the first one here, which is from David Pike. And he's asking, did you have any groups or companies that refused to participate?
No. We had better and lesser. We had some what we call golf cart rides where we go off, two of us in a cart, and have a little conversation. Particularly, there was one company that came in that was adamant that they weren't going to do it. But as we walked through what the authorities were and what the risk was, and then frankly, their own peers stepped in, we've had tremendous participation. Not that there haven't been some we had to have a little bit of conversation with, but it's been good.
Great, thank you. And so there's actually another question that came in as well. So we've got two more for you. The next one's from Rick, and he is asking, how do you determine when disturbed habitat is rehabbed and additional disturbance can occur? We have a fairly strict set of guidelines for how that's done. If it's disturbed, it would move from counting as disturbed and mapped as disturbed to what we would call transitional. And that's defined by 2 native grass species, perennials, and 2 native forbs. And we have a list of which ones that, are the desirables there. There's a more favorable view on bunch grasses in areas where they will grow, and the ability for sagebrush to come back. It wouldn't be counted as completely renovated, if you will, until it had all the components, which would include 5% sagebrush cover, the grasses and forbs, soil stabilized, and occupation by the birds. So it's a pretty high bar. The transitional will allow it to be considered differently, particularly if the birds are using it. So we'll get areas where you put a feature in on the landscape. If you use the minimization protocols and keep that as small as possible, you'll find birds will use it to forage and that sort of thing. But if it's too big, obviously you lose the middle out of it, and that would count as disturbed until it's restored to a point where it's usable by the birds. Great. And I think we've got time for one more question here. So this is from an anonymous attendee. They're wondering, how did the SGIT work with the local working groups?
Yeah, early on, it was a very, very tight relationship because we were trying to develop the maps. So we would come up with a map for the state, and they participate. Obviously, we have local working group members on the SIGIT as well. We went back to each of those local working groups and said, fact check us. And so I went to each of those meetings. Some of them we had 2 or 3. We sat down with their local knowledge, their local biologists, their local BLM folks, local Forest Service people, and said, did we get this right? And so they actually altered those boundaries significantly. I remember one we went to, and the conservation district manager said, this is a bog down here. It doesn't show up very well on the aerial photo, but it's actually duck habitat, not grouse habitat. That came out. And then we had another one right adjacent to it, and they said that ridge up there is actually really good nesting habitat. That went back in. So the end result of our work with the local working groups was that we actually added over 1 million acres to core based on their input and their knowledge of those local areas. As we got deeper into it, the local working groups didn't have quite as much a hands-on role, but more recently we just met with all of them a month ago, and we're now going to start re-energizing that local and state relationship because of what they can do relative to grant money, monitoring, and a bunch of other areas. And I think it'll re-energize those groups as well as the SIGIT.
Thanks. I think we have time to squeeze in one more last question, and then any other ones that come in, we will pass on to you to follow up with offline.
Sure.
So this next one here is, has the process lost its momentum? And if so, how do you keep the momentum going? No, it hasn't. It ebbs and flows a little bit, you know, as you ramp up, for instance, as Governor Gordon did his new executive order, we changed the format for the executive order pretty significantly between what we started with Governor Friedenthal, what we did as we worked through Governor Meade's 8 years, and then with Governor Gordon, we went to a very different format. It didn't change the order much. In fact, the order probably got stronger, but it changed the readability and the way that it works. So when you got into that, people were very busy. We had a lot of subgroups working. We did all that. Then as you get done with that, your need to meet obviously is reduced somewhat. So we went back to meeting, you know, every couple of months or quarterly. Obviously COVID's changed that, but we haven't lost. There are a lot of things that we can do right now. I think we're more focused on handbooks and manuals of how to do things, how to do a DDCT, that sort of thing. The other part that we're working on is data collection and how to do that better. And then the other area that we're looking at is restoration and reclamation. So you kind of evolve into different roles and different functions, but the group has stayed together, and we still have over a third, about 40% of the CIGIT has been on since 2007, which is incredibly valuable because we don't stop and go reinvent the wheel. We say, you catch up, but here's your mentor and they'll help you catch up.
Thanks very much, Bob, for answering those questions, and thanks folks for submitting them. It really helps to make this interactive when we have some questions to respond to. And I think we do have a couple extra ones that, Bob, we will be circling back with you on and trying to get responses that we can also post. So thank you so much for that presentation.